Hi, so I'm Mike, and this is kind of like a post-mortem of the Battlezone games. I don't like to use the word post-mortem because it's not dead yet. So this talk is basically a continuation of a talk that I started in Seattle, Casual Connect, and that was focused on Battlezone 1, but Battlezone 2 hadn't been announced yet, so I couldn't talk about it. So it's not informative, it's badly written, boring, and it is full of bad information. If you follow any of the advice that I give you today, it will be bad advice. So who the hell am I? I'm a 30-year veteran game producer, and I've worked at a bunch of big game companies, Sony, Acclaim, Fox, Activision, Mumbo Jumbo, and I've shipped over 100 games as a producer, and probably another 100 more as like an EP or a studio head. A bunch of great brands like The Simpsons and WWF. And currently I run a development studio called Big Boat Interactive. And so just a very small amount of history. In 1997, I worked at Activision with the last speaker, actually Tim, was around the corner for me. And I was part of the team that made this game called Battlezone, which was a really cool game. So what is this? What is Battlezone? Battlezone was basically a game that was, I should read my slides. Battlezone shipped in 1998, and it was the same week as StarCraft, and that was something we were very worried about, rightly so. And so basically, the idea of Battlezone was to take the two most popular genres at the time, which was first-person shooter and real-time strategy, and combine them into a game. And really the way I look at it is that Battlezone is a strategy game, first and foremost, and it is a strategy game that's played out in first person, in 3D. And it was a very highly rated game. It had 95, 98% reviews, and it was very well received by players. And it had a great story, right? The story was, it was the Cold War in space. You were on the moon fighting the Russians in this kind of secret war. And like I said, the press loved it. We were on the cover of a bunch of magazines, and the reviews were great. So in 2015 or so, I was approached by Rebellion, who had bought the rights to all the Battlezone games. And they said, hey, Battlezone's never been on Steam. It's a game that had really great reviews. Can we bring it back? How do we do that? And so, we made some suggestions what to do, put in new art, kind of re-release the game, and we went forward with that. It was based on the original code base, so we didn't port to Unity or anything like that. We wanted the game to feel like the original Battlezone. We wanted players who had played that game to go, yeah, this is that game, but better. And so we upgraded to a brand new, fully modern renderer and all new art. So, everything from the menus to the vehicles to special effects. We tuned up all the effects. We put in, all the modern kind of Steam features like achievements and trading cards. And kind of our big, new game feature was modding support. So we added multiple levels of modding. You could mod UI screens, you could mod game modes, and we integrated that with Steam Workshop and added a bunch of tools to do that. And that was a very successful feature because we had, I think as of this morning, I say 300 plus, I think maybe it's like 350, something like that, things you can download. So, this is the game in 1998 when we shipped it. And then, here we were 17 years later. It's not dramatically different, but again, you're seeing all new art. So we cleaned up the HUD, all new vehicles, terrain is upscaled. And so it was a better looking game. But to someone who had played the game in 1997, it was still the same game. And then, I just briefly will kind of mention that we took these 300 polygon tanks, but we wanted to keep the look and feel the same, but we made them cleaner, sharper, high resolution textures. And, again, we're trying to make the game look the same, but more modern. So it's kind of neat. One of the really smart things we did was we got this really great team of beta testers, and they were all people who have been playing the game for 15 years. And we sought them out, and we kind of, in fact, my Casual Connect talk in Seattle is about this beta test team and how they helped us make the game. So most importantly, they knew the game backwards and forwards way better than we did, because obviously I haven't played the game in 15 years. So, and a bunch of them actually offered to help us. And again, that was a big part of the talk that I did in Seattle. Like, we had guys writing tools for us. We had one beta tester who knew a bunch of the tools that we just didn't know how to use anymore. And so when we had collision bugs, she would just fix them for us, because she was the only one. She was literally the last person on the planet that knew how to use these tools. And one guy just went in one day and said, hey, I started rewriting all your special effects, and like, here's some scripts that I did. And they were great. So we hired that guy. Anyway, so that's one way to get a job. We wrapped that game up last year and shipped it. I should say last year. It wasn't last year. It was 2016. So there were some brief lessons that we learned. It's great to have that existing community. It's not something you can do with a new game. So when you're working on a 17-year-old game, there's a bunch of players out there you can grab. One of the other lessons we learned is we started with a really small team. And I think on the next slide I talk about the feature creep. But having a really small team really hurt us, so we had to grow the team a bit during development. And our early development philosophy was really just to replace everything in the game, just every system. By the end, we had done so much, and it was just a bit overboard, and we should have been more focused. And I'll get into that in like a couple of slides. And there was a lot of feature creep, and because of all that feature creep, performance was a big problem. And it wasn't a big problem for a modern gamer, but it was a big problem because we had carried over this community of players from 1997, many of whom were running on 15-year-old PCs, or really low-end computers that we hadn't bothered to test on. And so that was a very painful lesson for us to learn, was that we built this game specifically for these older players, and then we kind of left them behind. So, oops, sorry about that. That game wrapped up, and we shipped that, and it was fairly successful. And we did a Mac version, and we did a mobile version. And so as those were coming together, we said, hey, there's this, Battlezone II, and maybe we'd love to work on that. And that was a direct sequel to Battlezone I that shipped in 1999. And it was a really similar game, but had a few changes to some of the gameplay. And it was like a slightly different pace, and you didn't build the base in the same way. And so we ended up with like almost two distinctly different communities, right? So unlike a game like StarCraft, where StarCraft 1 players all move over to StarCraft 2, in the Battlezone world, there's a completely separate group of players that play the two different games. So we had to build a whole new beta test team, unfortunately. And the press loved the game, but they didn't like it as much as Battlezone 1. Like, Battlezone 1 was the innovator and had a great art style. The Battlezone 2 was the art style was a bit cleaner and more sterile. We were really excited because, I love the idea of taking these old games and making them new again. It was a much better starting point for us. The game itself was a brand new engine, so that meant, Battlezone 1 had a lot of legacy code from MechWarrior 2 and I-76, and Battlezone 2 didn't have that. So taking those lessons that we learned from Battlezone 1, we had a much more focused development plan. Renderer, multiplayer, mods. And we swore we weren't going to have as much feature creep as the first game. You know, really our philosophy was to do more for less. So, you know, taking all those lessons we had learned on the first game, hey, now we can, like, you know, do this better. And a big part of that was the art. Art's really expensive. There's a lot of art in a game like this. So how could we kind of do more for less with the art? Well, a big part of that was to focus on tuning up the art and not recreating everything. And that was also a big part of not blowing performance like we did the first time. You know, we don't need 10,000 poly tanks. You can have a 4,000 poly tank, but do beautiful shaders, and it'll look just as good. And that was certainly one of the lessons we learned with the first game. You know, shaders and lighting and materials can make more of an impact than just a lot of performance-eating polygons. So, and then, you know, the community, which is, again, the focus of my last talk, was like a big deal. You know, one of the community guys came up and said, I have this mod of upscaled models for every vehicle in the game. And it was like, there was my entire art budget right there. One guy had already done all the work. And so we reached out to him and basically said, you know, why don't you come on board and bring all the work that you've already done with you. So on day one, we basically had all of the art in a state that was ready to go. It wasn't perfect, but it was certainly art that we could tune up versus having to work from scratch. So, you know, there we were, and that was a huge boon to us. That really helped. So for all those models, they needed to be tuned up. They needed, you know, shaders and materials and things, but you know, it was a bulk of the work was done already. And it wasn't super high poly, which was great for performance. So, you know, kind of killed two birds with one stone. So just, you know, before and after here, and this game has been announced, and it doesn't ship until next month, so there hasn't been a lot of this kind of out there. Before, you know, it's hard to see on the screen, but, you know, pretty low poly, you know, no fancy lighting, and the after, and again, maybe this will look better on YouTube, but, you know, much better lighting, more contrast. The ground has specular, and the terrain's all been completely redone. And trust me, if you could see on my laptop, it looks great. So, you know, at the beginning, I said one of our philosophies was not to feature creep like we did on the first game, and that usually doesn't last very long. So one of the things we did was, you know, we really were looking at the terrain and what should we do, and we didn't plan to redo the terrain, right? Like, but in Battlezone 1, we didn't redo the terrain, and it really, I think it hurt us. So one of the community guys came up and said, I could redo the terrain. I have some ideas. He did one, we looked at it, it looked amazing, and suddenly I just said, okay, we've got to do this. This is a big creep, but we're going to do it because it looked so great. And it was just one of those things like, you know, there was just no way back once I saw it. You know, hard to tell here, but, you know, in the original game, because the terrain is height mapped, it was very flat, very plain, you know, no variation, no rockiness. And through normal maps and specularity and really great textures, he was actually able to completely upgrade the look of the game just with new terrain textures. So it was probably one of our most dramatic leaps forward visually. And then, you know, keeping with the philosophy of not adhering to our original design plan, you know, then we had some bugs in the pilot, and the pilot's like a very key thing. You're always running around on foot. That's one of the things of Battlezone, you can get in and out of your tank. So the same artist came in and he said, hey, I just redid the pilot. And it was like, okay, great, now we've got to redo all of the pilots. So, you know, it was one of those things, again, where that was not part of the plan, but it looked so good, there was just no way around it. We just had to do it. And so you can see here, like, our old pilot is this rickety old 1999 800 polygon model, and then the new pilot, you know, is full of detail and shiny. And actually, this is an 8 million polygon model that got baked down to a low poly model with texture and normal maps. and it just looks amazing, right? So, we're pretty excited about that. And again, it's one of those things where we're really lucky we had this really hardcore, passionate community that stepped up to help us out. This was a guy that was not a professional game developer. He just was a guy that played a lot of Battlezone and loved it, and just happened to also be an artist. So I liked it so much, I put it in the presentation twice. So I didn't know I'd have a back button. Anyway. So, that's basically it. Like I said, the game ships next month, and it's it's a lot of fun taking these, it's like a do-over. I get to take this game that I worked on 17 years ago and do it again. And we're using all of the old technology, so we're not like building the game from scratch, but we're looking at what's there and saying, how do we improve this? And it's been a great experience. So
awesome, Mike. Do you it's on Steam. Are any other platforms planned?
For Battlezone II, I know the plan is Steam and GOG.
Okay.
And you can cross-play multiplayer against Steam and GOG, which was a little bit of a hurdle we had to overcome because they are a little bit different. And what will happen after that, I don't know for sure. So for Battlezone 1, we did Mac and we did mobile, and the Mac is on Steam and GOG and the Mac App Store. So, yeah.
Cool. Questions?
As far as like music and sound design, did you redo all of that as well when you were doing this?
Not at all. And again, that was one of the great things about working on a project like this is that from a production standpoint, there's like 2 giant hunks of my work I just don't have to do because it's done already. So the music, which was done many years ago by a really talented musician, is great music. And unlike textures, music doesn't age like that, right? Like 18 years later, the music is still great. And we certainly, as part of the core development philosophy, this game is meant to feel like the same game, just a more modern version of the same game. So we wouldn't want to change the music. Sound effects too. It's like, sound effects are great. In Battlezone 1, we had a lot of problems where some of the assets weren't always there. So we were finding mistakes that hadn't been caught by the original dev team, which unfortunately was also me, where there would be like a couple of audio clips were missing because there's so many units and each unit has 20 audio clips. With Battlezone 2, because it was the team itself 15 years ago was more refined, a lot less of those problems. So yeah, it was great.
Thank you.
As a producer, I mean, you've grown. Like, what have you learned, in terms of, like, did you approach it differently? Agile development? I mean, were you still, like, looking at a waterfall? And, like, how?
Well, 17 years later, I mean, first and foremost, Battlezone was my first project as a producer. Right. So I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And I was just kind of hanging on for dear life. So certainly in that 17-year period, I actually learned how to produce games. So the approach was a little bit different. I would say it's something between Agile and Waterfall. I don't know if we have a name for it, really. It's just that, we had a real focus list of tasks. And this kind of project is very different than normal development because you're not building a game, you're just fixing a game. Mm-hmm. So we just had a list of systems that needed to be fixed, and we just kind of worked our way through it.
Cool. Questions?
So, since you worked with a lot of like community developers, were there any difficulties in getting them to work with each other or to basically make sure that builds weren't broken? And if so, like, how did you deal with that?
You mean getting the individual people to work together?
Yeah.
Like personality-wise?
Or just in terms of like different workflows?
I mean, one of we're a virtual team, so that solves a lot of the problems you traditionally have with game development. Nobody's noisy or smells or anything like that because you're not all in the same room. And certainly with all game development, there are personality problems. We have one guy who sometimes is hard to work with, and it just, I think that's part of the producer's job sometimes is that I'm like a marriage counselor. But no, we didn't have any. Why? What have you heard? No? Okay.
So you brought the game to Steam and GOG. You have any plans to think about moving it to mobile?
Well, so I'm just the developer. I don't make those decisions. It's above my my pay grade. On Battlezone 1, we did a Mac and a mobile version, and it was kind of neat because the mobile version wasn't a different version of the game. Being that it was 17-year-old code, it just ported over, and we had literally the entire game running on an iPad with no performance problems. It just, that iPad mini was probably 10 times the minimum spec when we originally launched the game in 1997. So I don't know if this kind of game does really well on mobile, especially as mobile has shifted to free to play, and premium is not as big as it used to be. And this type of game doesn't really lend itself to free to play. It's more of a premium game. So, but certainly we would do it if it was requested.
Great, thanks. Questions? All right. Everyone, thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Or Mike.